Hello, how are you? Many people who are concerned about osteoporosis and bone health think that all they need to do is take the calcium supplement and vitamin D prescribed by their doctor, and then there's nothing else to worry about, that we can eat whatever we want. But that's not quite how it works. There are some foods in our diet that can stimulate the excretion of calcium through urine or hinder the absorption of calcium in your intestines. I'm going to tell you which foods these are. And there's one food in particular that greatly increases calcium excretion, and many people consume it excessively on a daily basis. Stick around until the end. You won't want to miss this. Before we start, I want to ask you, if you care about your bone health, do you take any supplements prescribed by your doctor, or even medication to reverse osteopenia or osteoporosis? How does this work for you and your family? I would love to see your comment. If you can, go ahead and like the video now, because that's really important to me. It shows YouTube that you are supporting the channel, that you trust my content. When we think about bone health, usually we think about what we should consume to strengthen our bones, don't we? High quality protein, calcium, vitamin D. But even though many people do this, they end up eating foods that actually worsen bone health because they greatly increase calcium excretion, leads to more calcium loss through urine. And it can even impair the absorption of some nutrients in the intestine. So let's start by talking about what I consider the worst. But besides that, I brought some others for you to really pay attention to in your daily routine. Certainly, one of the worst foods in our daily lives is excess salt. Too much sodium is one of the worst enemies of our bone health, because studies show that for every extra gram of sodium we add to our diet, the body eliminates up to 15 to 20 milligrams of calcium through urine. That's a lot. This happens because sodium and calcium compete for the same reabsorption mechanisms in our kidneys. And the more salt you consume, the more calcium goes out along with it. So ideally, you should remember that salt isn't just in the seasoning you add at the table. Of course, we need to control the added salt when preparing our food, and that's already a good start. But be careful also with foods that contain hidden sodium without us realizing it. This is very common in ultra-processed foods, in those cured, smoked, processed meats, like the ham at breakfast, the bologna in your afternoon snack, the calabresa sausage you add to your beans, the bacon. So, be careful with these smoked, cured, processed meats, especially because they contain other ingredients, which I'll talk about later, that can harm your bone health and your overall health, obviously. But also be careful with industrialized, ultra-processed foods because they usually have a large amount of sodium and we end up consuming a lot of it in our daily lives without even noticing. Another food on our list is soda, even diet sodas, and especially cola sodas, because they contain a large amount of phosphoric acid, which disrupts the balance between calcium and phosphorus in our bodies. And when there's a lot of phosphorus and little calcium, the body starts to reabsorb calcium from the bones to balance these serum levels. I know there are a lot of people who replace water with soda, saying things like, oh, I'm going to stop drinking juice because it has too many carbs. Now I'll drink Coke Zero, 0-calorie soda. So be very careful with that. If you want to significantly reduce your intake of fruit juice for health-related reasons, you should consider switching to plain water, sparkling water, water with a slice of lemon, flavored water, or perhaps a natural tea with ice cubes. But please be sure to avoid consuming sugary soda, especially dark cola sodas. It's one thing to have a glass on the weekend if it's absolutely essential for you to include it in your diet, but I know there are people who drink soda, diet or not, every day. And if it's not diet, that's even worse. So be careful with that too. Also, be careful with excessive coffee. Caffeine slightly increases urinary excretion of calcium, so that's another point we need to pay close attention to. And each cup can make our body eliminate 4 to 6 milligrams of calcium, according to studies published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is a highly respected journal in the medical and nutrition fields. It may seem like a small amount, but if you drink too much coffee, like when you make a thermos of coffee and keep drinking it all day at work, throughout the day. So, if you drink a lot of coffee and don't consume enough calcium, you'll be stimulating this calcium excretion without proper absorption. So, what science usually says is that up to 3 cups a day is an amount that can be safe for the vast majority of people, along with a balanced diet that includes good sources of calcium. If you can, you could also substitute regular coffee with decaf, right? Maybe you just have a regular black coffee in the morning. And then, for the rest of the day, you choose decaf coffee to get that coffee flavor without the excess caffeine. That's an option for some people as well. Another food that actually isn't a food, but it's a drink that many people consume and that has to be mentioned here because a lot of people have it routinely, is alcohol. Alcohol has a direct effect on bone cells because bones aren't just made of calcium. Bones also have cells, like osteoblasts, for example. These are the structures that build bones, and alcohol inhibits the production of osteoblasts. And it stimulates osteoclasts, which reabsorb tissue, bone. In other words, it breaks down. It destroys more bone than it builds. It negatively alters this balance. Besides that, we know that chronic alcohol consumption by people who have a habit of drinking daily lowers levels of vitamin D and anabolic hormones, which could help improve bone health. So, ideally, if you have a chronic, serious problem like osteoporosis or osteopenia, you should avoid consuming alcohol as much as possible. Also, be careful with excessive consumption of foods that are naturally high in oxalate, especially if they haven't been cooked beforehand. For example, spinach, Swiss chard, and beets. They contain higher amounts of oxalates, so they shouldn't be eaten raw if you want to preserve the calcium in your bones, because these substances bind to calcium and impair its absorption in the intestine. So, ideally, you should boil or cook them for 3 to 5 minutes and discard the cooking water. That way, you can eliminate up to 50% of the oxalates. So, that's already a good option for you to add. And also alternate with other vegetables, which are also interesting but don't have as much oxalate as those. So, a good option could be kale, broccoli, watercress. These are rich in calcium but low in oxalate for you to add to your daily routine. Also, be careful with excessive sugar, right? I even mentioned this when I was talking about soda to you. Because refined sugar promotes chronic inflammation, as we know, and insulin resistance, which are two factors that harm bone formation. That's why you see many people with insulin resistance or uncontrolled diabetes who can also have osteopenia or osteoporosis. Excess sugar also increases the excretion of magnesium and calcium through the kidneys, which is an important factor for us to mention. So it's important for us to control the amount of sugar you add to your daily routine. And once again, just like I mentioned with salt, it's not just the sugar you put in your coffee, but everything that turns into sugar in your body. That white bread, that cornbread from the bakery, the little cake you sometimes have in the afternoon, it's not just the white sugar you add to a drink, but these are foods that contain a lot of sugar or quickly turn into sugar in your intestines. Be careful also with fats that are inflammatory, such as trans fats and saturated fats, because they greatly increase inflammation in the body. They interfere with the metabolism of fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin K2, which is super important for directing calcium straight to the bones and not to our arteries, and they increase low-grade chronic inflammation, right? Which harms bone health. So that's even why I mentioned it to you earlier when I was talking about cured and processed meats. Many of them also contain inflammatory fats. And that's why we should avoid consuming them. But not just those snacks, fried foods, sandwich, cookies, that kind of whipped topping that looks like whipped cream but stays stable at room temperature, that right there is trans fat. So be careful with the excess of industrialized inflammatory fats, which can be harmful to you. Tell me, which of these foods are you going to stop consuming today, thinking about your bone health? And which one will be the hardest for you to give up in your daily life and make the right substitutions? I would love to see your comment. Remember to like the video, it really helps me out. And share it with those who will enjoy it, with those who need it. Let's work together to expand this chain of good. That's what I want here with the channel. See you next time. Bye.